Welcome back, everybody, for our third installment on navigating information fatigue, scams, and hoaxes. My name is Jessica Bayless. I'm the Civic and Social Information Services lead librarian with Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh. On chat moderation, once again, is my colleague Amy, who you can send direct messages to if you have any questions or comments. Navigating Information Fatigue is brought to you by Civic CLP, a brand new grant-funded initiative which aims to provide the community with a greater understanding of the importance of the First Amendment in civic life through enhanced library programs, services, and resources. This initiative is supported through generous funding from the Pittsburgh Foundation. So just a quick recap. I think most of you have already participated in the first two webinars, but this will be recorded and sent to all registered participants via email within 24 hours. Please just send me an email if you don't receive it, or visit the Eventbrite online page if you were able to register ahead of time. I will be sending one last 7-question survey in the chat at the end, as well as in an email to you all tomorrow. I would really appreciate it if you could give us your feedback so we can continue to provide programs and events like this one. And for quality assurance and time management purposes, your audio and video are automatically muted during the presentation. Please use the chat window. You can ask questions or make comments publicly, or send them directly to the chat moderators, myself and Amy. And once again, live captioning is available via advanced real-time captioning solutions. If at any time you don't want the captions on, you are able to switch them off in the options below. All right. So I'm going to turn it over to our fearless presenter, Calum.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third and final installment of Navigating Information Fatigue. I want to be sure to thank Jessica and Amy and Stephanie again, who really made all of this happen and gave me a forum to talk to you here about scams and hoaxes, and hopefully tie together at the end of this presentation a lot of loose ends and overall lessons from that I think you could draw from this whole series. So I welcome any questions at the end, not just about scams and hoaxes, but if there's something that you thought of watching an earlier edition of this, feel free to bring it up. This is a good chance to do exactly that. But I want to talk about scams and hoaxes partly as a fulfillment of a lot of the things we've mentioned as bad argument. Not bad in this case in the sense of being invalid or not sound, like incorrect, although often that too. In this case, I think that scams and hoaxes are particularly important, both because it's something that we deal with all the time, especially now, and because it kind of shows the social life of argument. If you were sitting through me talking about deceased Canadian philosopher Stephen Toulmin's theory about warrants and evidence and data, then perhaps it occurred to you, that's boring, and you're not totally wrong. But I hope that this illustration here will sort of show some of the reasons why we're talking about these things and why the nitty-gritty, boring parts of argument are really important in helping to control how it turns out as a civic exercise and what it does. Scams are really old. They might even be hardwired in some ways in the human brain. I mentioned this last time, and I'm not going to sort of recap the entire thing, but one of the things on the reading list from a previous week is a book by Mercier and Sperber, which argues that human beings aren't particularly well wired to make good decisions. That in some ways we are, but we have a lot of problems, cognitive biases that are sort of built in, and heuristics, which are shortcuts that we use to think about complex problems that often aren't really adequate by themselves. And we'll talk about those cognitive biases and heuristics a lot more during this session. But if you remember, there's this example that I used about two monkeys. If you're the monkey who discovers a tree with red berries and maybe it can feed everyone, but maybe it'll kill you, even if you're a monkey who's really good at detecting which berries are poisonous and which berries aren't, you won't be successful the same way that another monkey is who doesn't know the difference, but is really good at convincing a second monkey that it should eat the berries. That monkey always survives the experiment, and the monkey that eats the berries doesn't always survive the experiment. It's an example of the kind of evolutionary pressure that exists, not just to make good decisions, but for human beings who live in a society. A lot of what we're really wired to do is convince each other of stuff, not necessarily be right about it. So we don't always use logic to do that. We use a lot of other mechanisms for persuasion, and we'll talk about some of those a little bit more. But that first monkey, the first monkey that found the red tree and convinced another monkey that those were good berries and the monkey should have them just to find out if they were poisonous, that was the original monkey scammer. And in a certain way, scams like that have always been with us. They've been magnified now, as the overall topic of this series suggests, just by the scale of information. Things that didn't work before or didn't work at scale now do. Scams don't even have to be good anymore to be successful. They just have to reach a whole lot of people, and then eventually they'll work. And I'll talk about the math of that a little bit later, and some of the famous scams that are easier now to pull off and some of the ones that maybe are a little bit harder. But there's a kind of evolutionary arms race. And I mean that maybe biologically, I don't know, I'm not an evolutionary psychologist, but at least socially, between people figuring out new ways to trick each other and people figuring out new ways to avoid being tricked. And my hope is that this discussion today will help contribute to that latter category a little bit. So I said scams have always been with us and that they're really old, but they're especially a great American tradition. There are some excellent scammers and very famous ones in the history of the United States. And hoaxes are as well. But before we talk about those, and I'll give a few examples of each one, I want to talk about the difference between a scam and a hoax a little bit. There's a lot of overlap between these concepts, but as I'm using them here, what I mean is that a scam is essentially a confidence trick. It's basically predatory at its core. It's a way of deceiving someone else into giving the scammer something that benefits them and as a result disadvantages the person who loses it. A hoax isn't quite the same. Hoaxes are efforts that people make to inspire false belief in other people. A hoax isn't always dangerous. Like every April Fool's newspaper article is a hoax in a way, but they still are about communicating disbelief or communicating rather improper belief. And that's kind of what unites a scam and a hoax in a way. They're both lies, but maybe the purpose of them or their social impact isn't quite the same. Although there's a lot of overlap between them, and we'll talk about that too. If the line is blurred, one of the first places that it became blurred, and maybe the greatest hoaxer and scammer in American history, was P.T. Barnum. If you ever have a chance to read anything that Barnum himself wrote, I can't recommend it enough. It's absolutely fascinating. His autobiography is great. All of his various writings are really interesting. This sounds bizarre, but I actually learned a lot from reading his book about how to manage your money, which sounds like you shouldn't trust it because P.T. Barnum wrote it. But then again, he was really good at this, and it's totally worth doing. The Fiji Mermaid was one of his most famous scams. So he had at the American Museum, which is a museum that he had started in New York, he advertised that you could see the Fiji Mermaid, an actual specimen of a mermaid that a sailor had caught and that he had purchased from the sailor. The mermaid was the back half of a fish sewed onto the front half of a monkey. And Barnum got away with this because people paid and then came into the museum. And by the time they saw the mermaid, he already had their money. So a lot of people complained about this. They said, this is obviously a fish and a monkey sewed together. What are you doing? And Barnum's response to that, I think, illuminates a lot of the logic of both scams and hoaxes. He replied, and you can read this in his book, in his autobiography, which is in our reading list there. He said, I don't feel like I've deceived anyone. No, it's not a real mermaid, but what you're paying for is the experience of being entertained. And you got that. I sold that to you, and you gave me money for that, not to see a mermaid, but to have fun. And I successfully did that. In fact, a fake Fiji mermaid is totally worth seeing by itself. So who cares whether it's real or fake? The whole point is that you wanted to see it, you gave me your money, and then you saw it. Maybe because you didn't believe that I really had it. So you kind of knew all along, didn't you? It's kind of your fault, not mine. There's a saying that's attributed to Barnum. I don't know if he actually said this, but that a sucker is born every minute. And that was kind of his basic business philosophy. Barnum sold entertainment, he thought. The truth and falsity of the things that he displayed didn't matter nearly as much. And this is the kind of basic logic that animates hoaxes. But besides Barnum, here are a couple of other famous ones that I'm mentioning because elements of what they did, come on, sorry, let me move this object here. Elements of what they did kind of played into some of the elements that are common to hoaxes that we'll talk about later. One to mention is Charles Dawson. If you haven't heard of Charles Dawson, he was the person who dug up the Piltdown Man. 1912, 1911 or 1912. There had been this major archaeological effort to find the missing link. People wanted to find physical evidence of what Darwin had described in Origin of the Species and the Descent of Man, and find physical evidence that there was something between apes and human beings. So along comes Charles Dawson and presents a skull with an ape-like jaw, but a basically human-like cranium. And he said, even better for his audience, he found that right there in England where he lived, in Piltdown. So he displayed the Piltdown Man. The Royal Geological Society of London actually displayed the Piltdown Man in 1912. And no one figured out conclusively that this was a hoax until 1953. All he had done is taken a human cranium, an orangutan's jaw, and teeth from a chimpanzee. See, it's the three sources that made this work. Not just two. He wasn't lazy. He put the work in to do it. And he tricked people, taught people in the field to believe that this really was a skull of the missing link. It's unclear whether he knew, by the way, or whether he was in on it, or whether someone had planted the skulls for him to find. But in any case, this was a major hoax, and it worked for a long time. 40 years it took before people figured out that this was made up. Another one in American history, and I'm mentioning this partly because of a personal anecdote, I'll tell about it in a second, is the Fox sisters, who were three sisters in New York, Rochester, I think, and were spirit mediums. And they claimed that they could communicate with the spirits of the dead, and that the spirits of the dead communicated through these rapping sounds, through tapping, basically. And people would come and pay to have the Fox sisters speak to their dead relatives. You can see this on television now. Spirit mediums are still a thing. It turned out that one of the Fox sisters felt guilty about this eventually and admitted that the trick worked by her snapping her toes, just like you snap your fingers. It's impressive by itself. I don't know. I can't do that. Maybe other people can. And that the rapping sounds are made up by her. However, even when she said that she was cheating, that this was a hoax and it was all made up, people still defended its authenticity who had been to spirit channeling activities. They said, but I felt the ghost touch me on my shoulder, or I could feel its breath on my neck, things like that. They essentially imagined evidence that confirmed the story that the Fox sisters had told them, even though none of those things happened. They weren't even part of the scam. People just believed them. I'm mentioning it partly because I know someone who became a spiritualist minister just a few years ago, and the spiritualist church that was founded as a result of the Fox sisters still exists, and there's still people who do mediumship activities and still people who do exactly what the Fox sisters did. Even when the scam was revealed, they later said, by the way, oh, I was just kidding. It's not actually a scam. We were joking about that part, not the first part. But even when the hoax was revealed, it didn't matter. There were still people who believe it, and there still are 100 years plus in the future. A last and famous one I want to mention because of its intersection with expertise is the Hitler Diaries. The Hitler Diaries were forged by a guy named Konrad Kujau, and he sold them to the Sunday Times, owned by Rupert Murdoch, also the person who owns Fox News, who bought the Hitler Diaries and had a famous historian named Hugh Trevor Roper, an English lord, in fact. He was created Lord Dacre. Verify the authenticity of the diaries. And he did. Hugh Trevor Roper, probably at the time the most famous historian in Britain, said, these are authentic. I've examined them. All 60 volumes of these are really Hitler's diaries that have been recovered. There's a whole story about it, his personal pilot, whose name was Bauer, I think, had crashed this plane, and it had a chest in the back with these secret documents, and a general had recovered them, an East German general had them and was now selling them to Kuzhou, and he had gotten them to the West, and so on and so forth. And people believed this for a long time. Hugh Trevor Roper's name alone was enough for them to believe it. I don't think Hugh Trevor Roper was a great historian for other reasons, but whatever. He was famous at the time. And it turned out that Roper admitted he didn't read German particularly well, which makes him not qualified to judge the authenticity of these documents. And he even said, I don't really know whether these are old. I can't tell. I don't know. It turned out that he should have known. They were printed on modern letterhead, and Kuzhou had just dipped them in tea to stain them and make them look old. That's all it took. He made an enormous amount of money selling these things. They were reprinted. You can still buy them on Amazon today if you're so inclined. 100% forgeries, and not even particularly good ones in a lot of ways, but totally forged. And he got away with it for a couple of years. So pretty impressive in some ways, especially given that Kuzhou already had a history, by the way, of forgery, and people still believed him. Bought the diaries. Rupert Murdoch, even after Trevor Roper said, I'm not sure that I am competent to do this, still paid for them, still published them. Partly on the Barnum theory. People would want to read them, even if they're not real. Here they are. They're entertainment. So there's a lot to learn from these, I think, and we'll keep talking about these lessons as we continue on. But I want to talk about medical hoaxes in particular, partly because of what's going on right now and the global pandemic. If you're watching this in the future, by the way, if you don't remember, there was a global pandemic of COVID-19 at the time that we recorded this in August of 2020. There you go. In case aliens ever dig up this disc after we're all dead. One of the first major medical hoaxer in American history was Clark Stanley, and his autobiography is on our reading list. It's a fascinating little story. Clark Stanley was the first snake oil salesman. Snake oil had actually been used in China, this oil from the Chinese river snake, I don't remember the species, that people would rub on their joints to help with rheumatism. But Stanley got that oil from rattlesnakes, and he distilled it and he sold it. And he would put on these public performances. I think he did this at the World's Fair once, maybe I think the one in Chicago, where he had these snakes and he'd slaughter them and he'd remove their fat and he'd make this oil, and people claimed that it cured all sorts of medical issues. It turned out Stanley obviously totally made this up. No one's even really sure where he got the idea. It might have been from Chinese migrant laborers in the West. But anyway, he had no evidence that this worked. He knew it didn't. And back then, there were all sorts of traveling patent medicine shows. This is before the FDA could regulate things. And before it wanted to stop regulating them. But he and other people like him would travel all over the country. They'd come to a town, they'd sell a patent medicine, they'd claim it solved all sorts of medical problems, and then they would leave before it turned out that it killed people or they went blind or whatever. And Stanley got to be wealthy and famous based on this exact scam. A second one that I want to talk about, and now we're sort of moving to more contemporary ones, is the Plandemic documentary. Has anyone seen this? There are a lot of people who have viewed this documentary already. It's a documentary, you can watch it on YouTube, I think, still. And it includes a doctor talking about the various aspects of coronavirus. And some of the things she says include that wearing a mask actually causes the coronavirus. It doesn't prevent it. That's the worst thing that you can do, because it activates coronavirus, your own body's coronavirus expressions, and that causes coronavirus. She also says kind of obliquely at one point in the documentary that the ocean is full of healing microbes. And so presumably you could help treat the coronavirus by exposure to the ocean and its healing microbes. Plandemic is made up. There's no evidence for this at all. And there are a lot of videos and things that debunk it, but I'm mentioning it partly because of the way that it uses expertise and also the high production values of it, like for a YouTube documentary, which we'll talk about more when we talk about how people fall for this. But it's not the only one among the many, many coronavirus hoaxes and other health hoaxes. Whole industries basically run on this. Lots of herbal supplements, a lot of beauty products, a lot of anti-aging creams, all sorts of things basically have no scientific evidence. Or if they are effective to some degree, a lot of them have an effectiveness that is not reflected by their price. So in other words, really expensive products that claim to do something aren't necessarily better than really bad ones that claim to do the same thing. But there's some like natural sounding ingredients that people like. And as long as you mix that natural sounding ingredient up with the rest of what you're doing, people are willing to buy it. So like add coconut oil to almost anything, or turmeric, or whatever. People are willing to accept, oh, I know that this thing has some benefits in other places, so it'll be good for me too. There's almost no clinical evidence or any like real controlled trials of almost all the kind of like herbal medicines and medical supplements and stuff that people get. Which doesn't mean that none of them work, by the way. It just means that they're highly, highly variable. And some of them are dangerous. So colloidal silver is something that's been pushed as a health remedy forever, actually back since the days of patent medicine. If you drink enough of it, it will turn you blue, literally, like it'll turn your skin blue. And it's being sold right now as a coronavirus medication. It's not. It won't help the coronavirus at all. It could make you sick. It could kill you. And at the very least, if it turns out that it didn't work, you'll advertise the fact that you were duped to everyone because you're blue. You're blue forever after you ingest a significant amount of it. I could add a bunch of other things here. Crystal therapy, almost anything on Goop, all sorts of stuff is made up and for the most part, at least potentially dangerous. Oh, one last one I wanted to mention is a weight loss pill called DNP, which actually does work. I read about this recently because I was reading an autobiography, a memoir of a federal prisoner who was placed in the last leper colony in the United States, which was in Louisiana. It closed down in 2015. And his cellmate was someone who had found out that the Soviets used a pill for their soldiers to help them resist the cold. They began using it in World War II, and they'd continued to use it. They considered it a major advantage over the NATO countries if they were ever to fight a war in winter. It worked, by the way. It worked. It raised body temperature a lot and helped people survive. They also ate a whole lot more. So this guy figured out, I bet I could sell this as a weight loss remedy. The problem is that it had been used as a weight loss remedy previously, just not in the United States. The reason that it keeps you warm is because it like accelerates your metabolism to dangerous levels. So a bunch of people died of hyperthermia. They essentially cooked from the inside as a result of this guy selling this pill. It's a hoax in some ways. It actually would help you lose weight, and not in other ways. Not in that way, but it's a hoax in other ways. It would help you lose weight, but the negative effects of it were concealed. It killed people, and it's illegal to use now, although there are some, it has some medical applications in very specialized ways. So it's another sort of category of hoax that I wanted to talk about. All right, so those are some examples, historical and current. I want to ask now, why do hoaxes work? Why do people fall for things like this? I'm going to suggest at least 3 reasons for this. Number 1 is information control. Plandemic is a great example of this. The quantity of information that you're exposed to is so high that it's difficult to determine what's good and what's bad, as we've repeatedly said throughout this series of presentations. The presentation of something often influences people much more than it should. In other words, if something looks professional, people are way more likely to believe it, even though that doesn't necessarily mean anything, and even though it might be contradicted by a lot of other evidence. Some of the tricks, if you're planning to, execute a massive hoax, include experts. So it's good to have 1 or 2 experts show up, even if they're not experts in the thing. Just saying that you have experts and presenting them as live beings that are present in the video or whatever website helps to convince a lot of people. A second mechanism, and we've talked about this extensively last week, is conspiracies. A lot of hoaxes work because they're coupled with conspiracy theories. You can see this in all sorts of advertising headlines online, especially things like you'll get an ad that says something like the one secret that doctors don't want you to know, and so on. So you click on it thinking, oh, well, I get it. The reason I've never heard that rubbing mugwort on my face can help cure cancer is because doctors don't want me to know it. It would mean that the pharmaceutical companies go out of business, et cetera. So in other words, it's a way of sort of creating this thing to fill out a whole backstory for the value of something and to explain why people have never heard of it and why it might work. Two other things are kind of related. A common element of hoaxes is some timeless quality to them. So for example, Clark Stanley said that the rattlesnake fat that he was used by Native Americans in the West for millennia to help cure all sorts of diseases and stuff like that. Saying that something has been used forever tends to convince people both that it might work and that it's safe, even if that's not necessarily true, or it doesn't work for the thing that you're selling it for. And there's an element even of kind of like cultural insensitivity to this too. A ton of medicines can be marketed as Chinese traditional medicines or ancient Indian remedies from India and so on. And the kind of Orientalist aspect of that convinces people, well, this must work. If they've been doing it for thousands of years in China, this kind of like mystical remedy must be a real thing. A lot of that really only works in Western countries, and it really only works in Western countries because it relies on pre-existing cultural stereotypes and things like that to convince people, and that's part of it. So that was number one of why hoaxes work, information control. I know it was a lot. The second reason is that people tend to want to believe hoaxes. They might want to believe it, as one of the comments says here, out of desperation, fake cures for incurable conditions or ways out of otherwise extremely difficult or unpleasant situations. Everybody kind of likes the magic bullet. It makes everything much easier. And so as a result, there's kind of a drive to believe in false information, if that false information is something that would help you hypothetically. Fear is another major part of that. People are afraid of all sorts of things like COVID, for example. And so they want to imagine that there's a way to resolve that. Hoaxes that aren't medical hoaxes also sometimes work just because people want the world to be exciting. So the Patterson-Gimlin film, which is a Bigfoot video, it's probably not real, although there's a guy at Idaho State University who I should mention who really does believe that it's real, and he's written extensively about it and so on and so forth. But isn't the world more exciting if Bigfoot is real? Isn't the world more exciting if the Loch Ness Monster is out there? Isn't the Scottish Tourist Board more profitable if the Loch Ness Monster is out there? And so on. History is more exciting for the same reason, which is why people love historical hoaxes. Things like the Piltdown Man make science interesting. All of those things sort of feed into the idea that people want to believe hoaxes. The last reason seems simple, but isn't, I think, as easy as it sounds. And the last reason is a lot of people just don't know any better. And what I mean is not to disparage people's information skills in general, but just the quantity of information that people are exposed to, the quality of the deceptions, the fact that you are allowed to buy, medicine for yourself, even if you're not a doctor. All of those things put pressure on people to make decisions that they aren't really qualified to make. And we all do this. We all fall for these things. The idea that it's only something that happens to other people is how hoaxes work, because part of a good hoax is convincing you that you're smarter than everybody else. But everybody falls for these things. There are a lot of experts saying a lot of different things, and it can just be sloppy thinking sometimes, which makes it a lot more difficult to figure it out. And we'll talk about how to combat that as we have through this entire series, a little bit more towards the end too. But that discussion of hoaxes brings me now to scams, and I want to talk about a few examples. One that's easy is that, and maybe a little contentious, is that a lot of for-profit colleges are good examples of scams. That there's a whole, and this is not like everyone and so on, but there's a whole genre of colleges that appeared essentially just to accept federal money, either from veterans or from Pell Grants, and that a good chunk of the way that they present themselves is basically deceptive in that they intend to get a lot of money, not to provide the services that they claim to provide. Trump University was alleged to be one of these things. You can see documentaries about this online where a lot of people went there and were deceived, not necessarily by Donald Trump himself, but by someone, into thinking that you'll get a job at one of the Trump organizations or companies, or you'll meet Donald Trump himself, and we'll provide these networking things and so on and so forth, which didn't happen. And eventually they kind of folded. But it's not just that. A lot of for-profit universities kind of have or developed along the same business model. The second example, and this is another recent one that you can see lots of good documentaries about, is the Fire Festival. If anyone remembers this, the Fire Festival was supposed to be this wonderful vacation getaway music festival in the Bahamas. Cost an immense amount of money. It was organized by this guy, Billy McFarland, and Ja Rule, the early 90s rapper. And people showed up at this Caribbean island believing it all, and it was a complete mess. There were supposed to be these like private villas, and actually there were like leftover army tents, and there wasn't enough food, there wasn't enough water, so on and so forth. There's a good documentary on Netflix about this, and there's another competing, also good documentary on Hulu about it, and there's a third one which I haven't seen, so I can't give the seal of imprimatur to, but it's a good example of both total chaos and the appeal of celebrity. Everybody liked Ja Rule way back when, so it's hard to say like, well, you know, Ja Rule, if he's in on it, it must be fine. They also advertised this perfectly. They hired a bunch of models and sent them down to this Caribbean island, did photo shoots that ended up all over Instagram. They paid all these social media influencers, which is a job title that shouldn't exist in a civilized society, but they paid a bunch of them to spread the message of the Fire Festival, and they got an enormous amount of hype. A bunch of people bought in, and those dudes are going to be in jail for a long time. And finally, the last scam that I want to mention before we start talking about mechanisms and why they work and so on is coronavirus again. There's a ton of coronavirus scams. There's just so many. This is an incredible opportunity for scammers. I had this hoax worked out once about explaining where this famous spy who was found in Australia, that he was actually this debate coach from Wake Forest University who disappeared in 1945. His name was Zon Robinson. I had this whole thing worked out, and it was really convincing, and I never did it. A friend of mine gave me the idea. I kind of wish I had, actually, because now the time for hoaxes is past. Hoaxes and scams have been blown out of the water by coronavirus. It's just too rich of an environment. I'm kidding. I wouldn't really launch this hoax, and I have nothing to gain by it. But here's some coronavirus hoaxes. Hydroxychloroquine is probably first on the list. This one's really complicated because there's a whole bunch of stuff of research that's still ongoing about the drug, and you can find people who are like credible people who still say, well, you know, with more research it might turn out to matter for some reason, and so on. What I'm about to say then isn't like a final verdict on the effectiveness of this drug. I don't want to, in other words, be proven wrong if it turns out that this drug works, but the evidence for it is suspect in a lot of ways. So there's this company called Surgisphere that was found that produces medical data, and they were one of the first to say this drug doesn't work. Here's a bunch of evidence that it causes heart problems in people who have coronavirus at a higher rate than it normally would. The problem is that Surgisphere can't really support a lot of that data, and they've made claims about other drugs too that are very suspect. But on the other hand, there are people who say that the claim that we know that hydroxychloroquine works is also suspect. So there's a whole lot of just murkiness around it. That is an ideal place for scammers to work in, because it means that there's a whole lot of evidence that already exists. There's already a debate, and solving the problem for someone, telling them this is the truth, really resolves a lot of psychological tension that makes scams effective. It helps to have an enemy. It helps to be able to say, well, there's this side and they don't want you to think that X thing does work. And all you need is a better story. And for the most part, you can get away with it. I already mentioned colloidal silver, but that one's come back. That's just the classics are just perennially return. And there are websites where you can buy blood plasma from people who supposedly had coronavirus. You can buy gallons of human saliva if you would like to, that comes from people who had coronavirus, supposedly. How would you know? And people will deliver that to you. There are scams where people send out mass emails that threaten to infect your family with coronavirus if you don't send them money right away. And one that I particularly like, there was this set of emails that came out that would say, they would look like they came from the email address of someone that you know. I got one of these, and it said, "I'm stuck in a meeting right now. I need you to go get a bunch of gift cards. I want you to buy these gift cards and then bring them to me in the meeting, and I'll pay you for them." That sounds really suspect, especially if you don't like the person that you got the email from, since the scammers don't really know what your personal relationships are like. A PhD student who I know at Pitt fell for this one. They replied and were like, "Oh my God, you're stuck in a meeting? How many gift cards do you need?" The story doesn't even make sense. But the point is that a lot of these things work in two ways. One, they work because you want to believe them. And we'll talk more about that for scams in particular in just a second. But they also work by numbers. And this is important to realize. You have probably been the target of hundreds of scams in your life, maybe even more than that. And for the most part, most of us don't fall for them most of the time. You don't have to. I sometimes wonder, like, how does this even work? I actually replied to a scammer once who claimed that that I could publish an article in their journal if I paid them. These academic scams are really common, and they're sloppy because I'd already published the article. That's how they knew about it, in another journal. So this didn't even make any sense. And I actually replied to that scammer and was like, "Could you explain what the business model for this is? Can you explain how this scam is supposed to work? We both know that this isn't real. So how many people do you expect to respond? And, what are the capital costs for doing this? Does this actually make money?" Unsurprisingly, I suppose the scammer never responded to me. But the point is that phishing especially works with huge numbers, and huge numbers mean that some people will accept it. Now, this doesn't just happen with medical scams and things like this. There's a famous example, and this is a logical problem that I talk about in my classes as well. And it was called the Atlanta stock scam. And this is how it worked. You would get a letter that said, "I am an independent stockbroker in Atlanta, and I want to help manage your money and make choices for you. I'm going to give you the stock tip for free. X stock will go up in the next month," or whatever. And it would. So you'd get another letter that said, "I'm glad you received my last letter. And as you know, the prediction that I made then was correct. Y stock will go down in the next month." And it would. And then you'd get a third letter that said, "Z stock will go up in the next month." And it did. So if you've got 3 letters from this person and they've correctly predicted the outcome of these 3 stocks, why wouldn't you trust them to manage your money? It makes it sound like they're financial geniuses. They weren't. Here's how the scam worked. It worked because they sent out 1,000 letters that said this stock will go up, and 1,000 letters that said the stock will go down. If the stock went up, they would just cross out all the people on the second list. Now, to those 1,000 people, they'd send out a new letter that said this other stock will go up, to 500 of them, and then a letter to 500 of them that said that same stock will go down. They were guaranteed to be right half the time. So it went down or whatever. So they scratched off the people on the second list. So they've got 500 people left. They sent 250 of them a letter. You see how this works. If you did this, if you iterated this enough and sent 10 letters, one person has seen you, or 10 people or whatever, have seen you make so many correct predictions that they're really willing to give you $1 million or whatever it is to manage. You don't have to know anything. You can just take the money and run then. That is the Atlanta stock scam. I've ruined it for you. You can't do it now. The FBI totally arrested that guy, and he's, I believe, still in federal prison. However, no, he died. Sorry. I forgot. Different guy I was thinking of. That's the same logic of how phishing scams work. Except email has made that even easier. And you don't have to go through all the work of managing all the people that you sent the different predictions to and so on. You can send out something, a scam. "I am a prince in a foreign country and I have $10 million, but I can't get it without, a bus ticket to the Capitol, and I need money to withdraw it. So if you send me $1,000 now, I'll send you $1 million later on," etc. So that kind of thing, maybe it only works 1% of the time, but that 1% is all it needs, because there's basically no cost in doing it. Often you can do it from outside the jurisdiction of the people you're sending the emails to, which means that the chance that you're criminally indicted, very low. And that's why this stuff basically never goes away. So those are a bunch of scams. How did these work? And why do scams work? They're a little different from hoaxes, as I said, in that these tend to be more predatory operations. And as a result, you'd expect people to be a little bit more on guard. Like, it doesn't really matter for most people whether the Piltdown Man is real or not, but it really matters whether the person that they just sent $1,000 to because they're stuck in a foreign country and they need to escape and so on, it really matters whether that person is real. Number one is pathos. If you remember us talking about this all the way back 2 weeks ago, ancient history and COVID time, but I mentioned that for Aristotle, there were three modes of persuasion. Logos, they appeal to reason. Ethos, they appeal to credibility. And pathos. You can see, ethos and logos both operating in all the scams that we've talked about so far. They seem to be logical in some way, even though they're not. There seems to be some credibility to them, like a celebrity is attached to them or an expert or whatever. But pathos is the real underlying motivation of scams, the thing that makes it work. The two primary things are just need and greed. People need things. So like PPE scams where people, say that they'll sell you an N95 mask for $1.50 or whatever. And it turns out to be like their used underwear sewn together to fit your face. That kind of thing works because people need the stuff, and that's part of it. But most financial scams work out of greed, or a lot of them do ultimately, or vanity, something like that. People want to feel superior to other people by knowing that they could do this exclusive thing that other people couldn't, fire a festival, or that they know the secret that should be so obvious. Why don't people figure it out? You all must be stupid. Snake oil, things like that. Or just compassion. A lot of supposedly charitable organizations prey on people too. There's all sorts of places where you can donate money for some cause and then they just steal your money. That's what Steve Bannon is being accused of right now and his Build the Wall project along the Mexico border. But there's also a lot of international aid agencies that have enormous overhead and things like that. Some of them are good, some of them aren't. We'll talk about telling the difference a little bit later on. So pathos is part of it. They appeal to emotion. They appeal to greed, to vanity, to superiority, to fear, to desperation, all of that stuff. A second way that these work is social ties. The original confidence man, where the term comes from, was an actual person. His name was William Thompson. And he had this scheme in New York where he would walk up, he'd dress well, he would walk up to a well-dressed person on the street and say hello and remind them that he's an old friend named Billy and so on. And then he would ask if he could borrow their watch till the next day, their gold pocket watches. And people would give him their watches. How did this work? This sounds crazy. This is how it worked. At the time, it would have been socially unacceptable for someone to say that they didn't remember an old friend. And when that old friend said, and this was the quote where you got the name, "Do you have the confidence in me to lend me your watch until tomorrow?" People would be embarrassed and they would say, "Oh, of course, yes, anything for an old friend." And again, it didn't always work, but it sometimes worked. And he stole an awful lot of gold watches. He actually wasn't caught until he borrowed someone's gold watch and didn't give it back. And this guy came to the police and was like, "All right, I didn't really know this guy," and explained the whole thing, and they arrested him. He'd stolen maybe hundreds of watches and lots of money before that from people who are just too embarrassed. And that's how a lot of scams work, by the way, how they continue to work, is that people, when they figure out what happened, are often too embarrassed to admit that it happened to them. And so as a result, the scam can continue. So social ties and social expectations are a major element that maintain scams. And you could add to this kind of like social tie and social expectation thing, celebrity influence again. Oh, Gwyneth Paltrow, she was awesome in the Royal Tenenbaums. She must know what kind of stuff I should put on my skin to prevent UVB radiation from prematurely aging me. Obviously. Alex Jones, hey, he's a conspiracy theorist and a radio talk show host in Texas. If he thinks that these pills are going to restore my inherent masculine vigor, then he must be right, so on and so forth. People fall, Ja Rule says that this festival is going to be good. People fall for celebrities all the time because they like them. It's the same reason that celebrities are outspoken about a lot of social issues that a lot of them just like aren't trained or competent to talk about, because they have big audiences and they're good at acting when they're actors. That's why so many actors are involved in this kind of thing. It's a really useful thing. And I'm not saying that they're deliberately deceptive, like nothing against Gwyneth Paltrow. I'm just saying that people say things with great confidence that they don't really know, especially when there's a financial incentive to say those things. Not naming any names. Last thing I want to mention is coronavirus, is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is another way that scams continue to work, even when they shouldn't. What I mean is that if you're smart about a scam, or it's a bad scam and you're suspicious about it, a lot of people might do the research to Google it and find out, does snake oil actually cure mumps or whatever? If the scam is well enough designed, even like pretty sloppy, it doesn't really matter. There'll be some information present somewhere about this. One of my favorite hoaxes has this. It's about the Northwest Pacific tree octopus, which is supposed to be a giant octopus that lives in trees in the Pacific Northwest in the United States, which is now going extinct due to overpredation by Bigfoot, so the website says. Usually the last line would let people figure it out, but often they don't. And this has actually tricked a bunch of people. There's an experiment on middle school kids, apparently you can do that, asking them to figure out whether it was true or false. These were supposed to be internet savvy kids and so on. Every single one of them fell for it. And when they were told it was a scam, most of them couldn't figure out why. How does it work? It works because the guy who did that also created all these web pages that are like, here's a video of a baby tree octopus being born, and here's a recipe for tree octopus stew, and here's like pictures of the tree octopus in the wild, and so on and so forth. There's all this confirming evidence. If you Googled Pacific Northwest tree octopus, you'd find a bunch of evidence. You'd only find evidence that said that the theory is right. At a broader scale, this is kind of how we often do research, but we shouldn't. If we want to know whether something's right or wrong, we usually already want it to be one or the other, and we tend to read more of the stuff that confirms what we already believe. That's called confirmation bias. And that's something that kind of continues to make these scams work. There's a question. How do you deal with scams done by those who are homeless, having a hard time, and approach you for money? Many homeless populations get a bad reputation because a few have scammed people, and that embarrassment leads to stereotype for the majority. Excuse me. That's a good question. There are different ways that you could do that. I have a friend who's now famous, famous-ish in his circle. He's a lawyer who I won't mention. But we were together once walking on a street in Berkeley, and a woman came up to him and said she couldn't afford her medicine. And he asked her to show him a prescription. And he actually went to her apartment with her, and she showed him the prescription. He saw that she lived in a place with no furniture and so on. And he's very wealthy. He just bought her medicine. I think he bought $2,000 worth of it, maybe. That's one approach, but I'm mentioning it because it's not what we can usually do. It's really hard to verify things like that. And the answer to this, I think, is partly personal. So there's a guy in Shadyside in Oakland. I've run into him more than once who does this trick where, has anyone run into this guy? Is it just me? I've run into him a bunch of times. He'll come up and say, he's always like wearing, business casual clothes or something, and say, I locked my keys in my car. I have this meeting. Can you tell me how to get to this building? So this is how he did it that I think worked better. He's done it to me twice. Once he was like, can you tell me where this building is? How long would it take to walk there? I was like, 3 hours, dude. He was like, okay, well, I locked my keys in my car. I need to call a locksmith. Can you lend me a little bit of money? And I'll call the locksmith and so on. I've got like my wallet and stuff is in the car. I've got like $500. I'll give you like $100 for helping me out. The first time this guy did this, I was like almost immediately suspicious. I also kind of ruined it for him because I don't have a car and I walk everywhere. I like walking. So he was like, could I walk to this place in Squirrel Hill from Shadyside? And I was like, oh yeah, for sure. And he was like, how long would it take? And I was like, I don't know, 2 hours. It's fine. You'll be all right. Anyway, the scam works obviously because you're supposed to believe the guy who's talking to you directly. It's a very personal thing. The second time he did it to me, I just said like, by the way, you've done this to me before. So, and I didn't fall for it then. I see you've made some improvements. Does this work now? And the guy was like, I have to go, and ran away. that's a case where you can kind of like figure it out. The more complex the story and the more props that are involved, car, business suit, so on, maybe the more likely it is to be a scam. However, and those are both like pieces of advice I'm giving just in the spirit of answering the kind of like core of the question. How do you know? I think my personal approach is that if someone asks me for money and I can afford to give it to them, I don't go through all of this. That's, the point of saying, and I was going to talk about this a little bit later, that scams work on confidence, that they work on social trust and so on, isn't that you should never trust anyone. For the most part, like if someone walks up to me and says, I need to take the bus and so on, who's like, obviously down on their luck or whatever, but I don't have the money to do it. All I need is $10. I know that's not how much it costs to take the bus anywhere in Pittsburgh. I'll just try to give them what I can. Because I think people are often feel like they're forced into making up some story for why they need the money instead of just telling you the truth. So that's an issue, I think, of kind of like personal virtue and what you decide you can do, as well as the own means that you have. But for the most part, I never interrogate someone who I meet on the street who needs $1 or something like that. It's not worth it for me. And the reason that I say that is that, leaving aside like personal ethics and stuff like that, the cost to social trust of not trusting people who appear to be in need, I believe, is higher than the cost that is exacted by people getting $1.50 or whatever that they don't actually need. Okay, so that's actually a good segue into what do you do about scams and hoaxes. Here are some suggestions, and I'm happy to talk about them more in the remaining time that we have. Number one, look for patterns. I mentioned colloidal silver partly because these things happen again and again and again. I'll get to probability a little bit later and how it links to these weeks. That's a good question. The same scams tend to just show up constantly. The content of them might change, but the basic form of them doesn't. I didn't talk about Charles Ponzi because I assumed that most people know what a Ponzi scheme is. But Ponzi schemes just happen again and again. You can immediately identify something as a Ponzi scheme because the basic structure keeps happening. Phishing emails are a whole lot like that Atlanta stock scam, which is like 70 years old now. People, if you know enough about the history of hoaxes and scams, the reason that I mentioned these historical examples in some detail is partly because their form just reappears again and again and again with minor variations. And for the most part, that works because people either don't ask questions about them or don't know about the previous iterations of those scams to be sort of on the lookout for them. So learning the history of this stuff, I actually think helps a lot. Also, it's fun. You encounter all sorts of fascinating characters like Clark Stanley and P.T. Barnum and so on. A second thing that I would say is trust but verify. Old Ronnie Regs said this way back when. It's important to critically examine data. So what I mean by that is to say, you shouldn't give up on social trust, as I already mentioned before. The world would be a worse place probably if no one ever trusted anyone, and people who were in need, for example, desperately needed to prove to everybody that they're in need. Similarly, it would, like, professional interactions, personal interactions would be really difficult. Some of you may have been ripped off by your family members before or friends. I think it happens to almost everyone, at least at some point. In my mind, at least, even if you could be so savvy that that never happened to you, the result of how you can conduct yourself in the world might not make it worthwhile. So some kind of trust has to happen. You can't always be skeptical of everything because that just creates the exact opposite problem. Instead of falling for everything, you believe nothing, which means that, again, it's really difficult to make decisions. So verify. One of the reasons that we've been talking about argument and its structure this whole time is that the structure of argument is one way that you can run through a scam. So if you remember the Toolman model, which I've referenced a couple of times as being the boring argument model, it's not super exciting, I promise. Everybody read his book. Anyway, the Toolman model has 3 parts for an argument. A claim, where you say something about the world. You make a contested claim statement about it. A warrant, which is the reason why the evidence lets you make that claim, and the evidence itself. So in other words, you have evidence, some observation in the world, You have a warrant, which is some principle that says, because this evidence is true, we can conclude that X, and X is the claim, the thing that's true about the world, supposedly. You can run a lot of scams just through that model and see if they shake out. So we'll take one from Plandemic. Masks cause COVID. Why? Because masks activate coronavirus expressions in your body. The claim is that masks cause COVID. The warrant is that they activate coronavirus expressions in your body. The data is the part that's totally missing. What even is a coronavirus expression? I'm not the kind of doctor that helps people, but like I still don't know. And I put some time into trying to crack this particular conspiracy theory nut. So what is it? Where's the data that says that those things exist? Where's the data that says that masks cause this? Do you have data that says people who wear masks are more likely to get coronavirus than others? These are all questions that, excuse me, become apparent when you see the structure of how the scam is supposed to work, how the argument is put together, in other words. Another thing is just so let me say something about expertise here as well. Well, no, I'll wait for that. Another thing that I think is useful, and we're still talking about just scams in general here, and hoaxes to some degree, is you can take a lot of sort of just simple precautions against these things. Always, again, you don't have to be skeptical of people, but you can be skeptical of information. So, for example, check email addresses. Like the thing I said earlier about the gift cards, that particular scam, it came from that person's name at gmail.com, and it was sent to my university account. I don't know that person's Gmail address. We always use our university accounts to correspond when we're forced to. That is a clear indicator that this is wrong. I've even seen some really lazy ones, like I love Russian hoaxes. I've been a big fan of them since I was a little kid, but I got this email a little while ago that was the full email address of someone I know professionally at, whatever it was, scam.ru. And the part of the message was in Russian. Like they hadn't even bothered to change the Cyrillic characters in the signature line at the bottom of the message. Those are extreme examples, but like even just little things like, is this really this person's email address, can save you a lot of worry and transform something that is potentially dangerous into something that is hilarious almost automatically. Google stuff. Google the key noun in whatever the email is about plus scam. And most of the time you'll turn something up. Websites like Snopes and PolitiFact can be helpful. There's a new project called The Commons. It's being started in Virginia that should do this for political statements as well fairly soon. It's a nonpartisan group. But there's all sorts of information shared almost immediately because, like I said, it's an arms race between people who are trying to trick you and people who are trying to not be tricked. And you can rely on social knowledge to help you with the second of those things, at least sometimes. You should double check with outlets that you trust as well. This is the part that makes the least sense to me about coronavirus scams in particular. Every so often I get an email that says like, there's a cure for coronavirus and we know about it. Were that true, would this shady email really be the first time you heard about that? Whatever news sources you trust, and you shouldn't just trust the ones that agree with you, and you shouldn't just trust one. You should have a range of places where you check for this kind of thing. None of them probably are 100% accurate, but the point is that you can create a better composite picture by reading all of the stuff than just one thing. So whatever it is, the set of news sources that you've decided to include in your stable of trusted sources, see whether they've ever heard of this coronavirus cure or Nigerian prince scam or whatever it is, and make sure that you double check and try to figure it out. If you hadn't, it's always helpful to just ask yourself, if I believe what's in this information, who benefits from it? If I don't believe it, who benefits from my lack of belief? Usually there's some story built in about conspiracies or something like that, but those stories rarely hold up to a good critical look that requires evidence for things. Last thing I'd say, and this should be obvious, but I have to say this. is that you just shouldn't give out your passwords and personal information to anyone. I'm mentioning this partly, a friend of mine is a lead engineer at Facebook, and he told me about two teams that Facebook uses to test its information. One tries to like hack into the databases and stuff to like steal things from Facebook. It's an internal team. So if they manage to do it, then they report how they did it and they fix it. Same thing as Tiger teams, which used to exist for the Department of Defense. But they have another team called the social team, and the social team just tries to scam people for information within Facebook to see if it works. So when the new Star Wars movie came out, I guess it was episode 7. Yeah, when episode 7 was coming out a few years ago, the social team sent out this email to a bunch of people at Facebook that were just like, Facebook is going to buy you tickets to it. You know, this is a perk for all Facebook employees. All you have to do is enter your password. And according to this friend of mine, something like 50% of people at Facebook fell for this and just gave up the password to their accounts that would have let someone hack into Facebook and like steal enormous amounts of personal data and stuff like that. So just like, you know, even the nerds can be fooled by other nerds. So be very careful about where you give out information. Basically, don't do it. Last thing I want to mention about scams is report them. So I mentioned earlier that one of the reasons that scams continue to work, and actually why a lot of just like socially naughty practices continue in general, is just because people don't report them. They feel embarrassed that they were taken advantage of in a scam. They feel stupid that they fell for something like this. And as a result, they just don't want to tell anyone about it. They just want to pretend that it never happened. That is how these things continue. You might feel dumb, but you're not the only one to fall for it, almost certainly. It's worth reporting those things. And you can Google the scam itself to figure out who. The FBI accepts some of them. You know, other things you'd report to other agencies. At the very least, there's websites that track this kind of thing. Make sure you say something so the next person who's curious about this and Googles the problem that you've encountered can find information about it. So I'm going to give a few things about the overall series here very quickly, and then whatever questions, comments, discussions, complaints that you've got, that's what the last of the time can be used for. So here's some overall lessons I think you can draw from this whole discussion, all three parts of it. Number one, a good argument has a valid, which means logically proper, claim, warrant, and evidence, which are the three parts that I talked about earlier. The basis for being able to navigate the quantity of information that you're exposed to is just that. Break it down to its simplest parts. What are they trying to say? What's their evidence for why they're saying this? And does that evidence really support the thing that they're trying to say? If you can run through that mental exercise, the more you do it, the faster and more automatic it becomes, the less likely you are to have a partial and incomplete view of things that matter to you politically or personally, even culturally, I guess. And the more likely it is that you'll be able to present your own ideas in a way that are not just persuasive to other people, but that they can disagree with in a way that's productive for you. It's a clear, logical way of thinking about and presenting arguments. And you want to be able to do that so people can point out flaws in your own reasoning. Because a lot of what we've said basically operates partly on the principle that we always think we're better at figuring these things out than other people are. And we're not, for the most part, which is the second thing I wanted to say. We're not naturally great decision makers in a lot of ways, just as human beings. But we think we are. If you remember the Dunning-Kruger experiment that I mentioned before, where they asked 100 people to say whether they were average, below average, or above average drivers. About 90 of those 100 said that they were above average drivers. That is, you don't have to be a statistician to figure out that that is impossible, if that can be generalized to the whole population. And this experiment's been done again and again in different forms. People, for the most part, think that they aren't the ones who are going to fall for these things. And the hardest part is admitting that maybe you are. In fact, the best scams work by starting to convince you that you aren't the one who will fall for this. If you've got any Simpsons fans in the audience and you've seen the monorail episode, famously, this guy is trying to get the town of Springfield to set up a monorail, comes in to a town meeting and starts to explain the monorail and then just stops in the middle and says, oh, well, You wouldn't like it. It's more of a Shelbyville idea, which is like their rival city. So the mayor says, we're twice as smart as the people in Shelbyville. Tell us what you want and we'll give it to you. That is like weirdly how a lot of misinformation works. It appeals for the idea that you're twice as smart as the people in Shelbyville. And so therefore you're willing to make an awful decision to believe something. Because it appeals to your vanity, your sense of belonging to a group, perhaps, or all sorts of things along those lines. Number 3, always ask these 2 things about information that you're uncertain about. And this could be conspiracy theories that you could read. It could be hoaxes that you could run into. It could just be political arguments that people make. These 2 things. Number 1, who gains from this? And number 2, is this practical? So this matters a lot for like conspiracy theories, for example. When someone says something like the moon landing was fake or the earth is flat is a good one. How many people would have to be in on that for it to work? Millions, probably. Pilots, explorers, anyone who's ever been to space or says that they have, or all sorts of people. Anyone who's been at high altitude, geologists, so on and so forth. I know people who say that they've been to the North Pole and the South Pole. Like lots and lots of people would have to be on this. Not just in the United States, but all over the world forever with near perfect information control. Is that practical? No, probably not. A version of that is that if someone is trying to convince you of something, one thing that helps filter out the need to constantly make decisions is to say, what is the practical effect? What would I change in my life if I believe or don't believe this? If the answer is nothing, don't worry about it. You've got better things to do. There's more information to filter, and there will always be more. The internet is just a fire hose of crap that is pointed at each of us all day. And if you're looking for something that and if someone wants to convince you of something that doesn't matter to you, find something else. There's always more stuff, more things that are more rewarding. Number 4, most bad information appeals to base passions, as we've mentioned, especially in this section: fear, greed, vanity, even charity, things like that. The more emotional the appeal, the more scrutiny you should give it. The more that an appeal is based on emotion, I suggest the more attention you should pay for it. Not because that means that those appeals are likely to be wrong. So my point is not emotional appeals tend to be wrong. My point is that wrong appeals tend to be emotional, because that's how people circumvent logical problems and what they're saying. They do it by appealing to something other than logic to try to fill the gaps and get through it. A version of that is that if it makes you feel better to believe something, I hate to say this, but you should be especially skeptical of it, because that's how confirmation bias works. For the most part, we believe the things that make us feel better, or the things that we want to be true, even if they feel worse to us, but they fit with our view of how the world works. We tend to believe stuff not because we've done a rational calculation of all the various sides of an argument, but because this is kind of what we were always trying to believe. The more that you feel good about something, the more scrutiny it deserves. If it turns out after all that scrutiny and you've really done your due diligence that it was right, feel extra good, because now you can feel good about feeling good because you've done the work to deserve it. Number 5, again, trust but verify. Here's a way to put this together. Who do you trust on this issue and why? Who do you trust means, is this a source that you necessarily trust? On this issue is important, because you can believe someone in general or some organization or whatever and not think that they're correct about a particular thing. Like most people who deny climate change science, a lot of them are economists, for example, not climatologists. And lastly, why? Why is this a source that you trust? Like, why do people believe the person on Plandemic? Do you know her? Do you know anything about her? Is there any reason to think that she's more credible than this? If Ogopogo here told you that there was a cure for coronavirus and it was wandering around in the ocean, would you believe him? Why? You believe him just because he has a bow tie? It's a clip-on. He didn't even put this on. He can't read. He doesn't even know how to tie a bow tie. He just made it all up. Why would you believe the pandemic person over my dog? Well, she says she's a doctor, but raise your hand if you have no federal charges against you. Look, right here, which arguably makes him a more qualified source of information than the person who made Plandemic. Thank you, Doug. He's a good visual aid. Why do you believe people? Why do you trust them? Is a hard question to ask. But if the answer is because they agree with me, that just goes back to confirmation bias. Well, maybe they're right. Doesn't mean they're not, but it doesn't mean that they are either. And it deserves a hard look. Last thing I want to say is that certainty is too much. And this is what I meant when I was talking about probability earlier. The art of rhetoric, what I am nominally a professor of, rhetoric developed is different than other methods of inquiry. And this is why. A lot of questions can be solved with some certainty. Like we can figure out whether a diamond is harder than coal, for example, and be really sure about what we determine. We can even be very certain about some things like values that we hold. So like if you think charity is an important value, you can be really certain of that. And there's no kind of like two-sided argument that you have to go through necessarily to determine because it's normative. It doesn't have a right or wrong answer really. The whole point of rhetoric is an art and a science. Techne kind of means the same thing in ancient Greek. The point of it was that sometimes we have to make decisions when the information available to us is insufficient. The goal is not to make the right decision every time. That's ideal, but it's not realistic. We can't be right because this kind of information processing that we're talking about, all the stuff we're talking about in detecting deception and deceiving other people and figuring out what evidence is good and what evidence isn't, those things apply mostly to situations where we have to make a decision of some sort, but we can't be 100% sure about it. And expecting yourself to be is too much. Just the human brain is 3 pounds of meat. You think, could you trust 3 pounds of meat to figure out anything? I'm not even sure I could feed a large barbecue with it. The point is that we have to be as not wrong as we can, which isn't the same thing as always being right. It's about increasing the probability that we are correct. And instead of holding certain notions about the world when they can't be proved with certainty, holding probable notions about it instead. So for example, the simplest theory is the most likely to be correct, the one with the fewest necessary preconditions for it to be true. It's a principle called parsimony. It's not always true, but it often is. And applying it as a standard doesn't mean this thing is wrong because it doesn't meet the principle of parsimony. That creates the same problem with certainty that we have if we just believe everything, absolutely. Being critical about something, critical thinking, isn't rejecting things out of hand, even because they're illogical. It's about reducing certainty of them. If it's important that you make a decision still, that you think about it, that just means thinking about alternatives more, weighing the possibilities, considering the evidence more. But the one thing that you can't expect is to be 100% right all the time, because you'll constantly be frustrated and constantly feel disappointed. There's no way to do that, and there's no way to do it accurately. That's what I've got to say. So I'd like to hear questions and things like that. You have my contact information. I am always happy to figure out that, to help you figure out if anything is true or false or whether the evidence is good. Just send me an email that includes your social security number, date of birth, and mother's maiden name, and I'm happy to help you with any of those issues.
Oh, my word. Thank you so much, Calum. And Pogo, right? Guest
Yep.
starring. Great to have furry friends on any webinar. So I just pasted Calum and mine's contact info if you have questions about anything that he's talked about or any programs like this. Feel free to reach out. We didn't have a ton of questions come in the chat, but now is the time to share in our final moments. No pressure. And while you do, I'm going to get the link to our final survey that I would love everyone to complete for me so that I can use lovely data, which Calum mentioned is very important when I'm making informed decisions.
I would recommend a book. It just occurred to me. I should have said this earlier, called How to Lie with Statistics. It's a classic by a guy named
Ah,
Huff. And it includes all this stuff about like visually manipulating data to lie to people. It's like 70 years old now, and there's still so much good stuff in that book about manipulating charts and graphs and things like that. So
excellent. Wonderful. We did get a question just about a clarifying parsimony and parsimonious, different root words. And then also, can machines learn to spot bad arguments or only bad facts?
that's a good question. So I'm pretty sure that both parsimony and parsimonious have the same etymology if you go back far enough, but political scientists tend to use parsimony as a term of art. So, for example, there's a book, this is going to sound weird, but there's a book published in 1994 called The Proliferation Puzzle. And the afterword of that book by Peter Feaver has a bunch of stuff about how to make theoretical decisions in political science. And I'm recommending it not because it's like the most famous classic, but I thought it was like unusually clearly written and smart. His point is just that it's something, a parsimonious theory, one that exhibits parsimony as the principle, is what he calls it, means that it just has fewer assumptions that are necessary to reach a conclusion. The principle of parsimony that he's describing isn't really all that different than Occam's razor. They're similar. That the theory that requires the fewest conjunctive elements to be correct is the most likely to be true. So I think I gave this example in a previous discussion, but there's a famous survey question that went out to a bunch of people that was something like a bunch of psychology undergrads, I think, where they were asked to pick between these options. So Sue is the person in the survey who's described. Sue is a committed anti-war activist and invested in social justice issues, and an environmentalist who believes in full equality of women economically and politically in the United States. Is it more likely that she is A, someone who works in the finance industry, or B, someone who works for a small development bank that gives microloans to women in developing countries to start their own businesses? About 60%, if I remember the number, of students who saw that said B. The correct answer objectively is A, because A includes the possibility of B. Similarly, like theories like conspiracy theories that require that you believe a whole lot of different things to be right tend to convince people because a lot of data, which isn't always relevant to the conclusion, makes people think this is a complicated and well thought out theory, and therefore I believe it. The point that Feaver and that the theory of parsimony are trying to make is just that our impulse should be the opposite, to say the more crap that I have to believe to come to this conclusion, the less likely that that conclusion is to be correct. About machines and bad arguments, so that project that I mentioned, the Commons, is actually working on semi-automated ways. They're working on human algorithms to try to calculate bad arguments, but people could do this mechanically in theory. I'm really, really skeptical about that. I'm not a computer scientist and I don't know all the details. The reason I think I'm very skeptical of that is because non-literal and especially ironic expressions are still very difficult to process at scale effectively. And so I'd be worried about the error rate basically of that. But in theory, an argument that's valid can be figured out very easily. The problem with doing that is that, I mentioned this, I think, in the first week, there's a concept called enthymeme in rhetoric. Enthymeme is where people don't present the entirety of an argument. They only present parts of it, and they assume that you either know or can fill in the rest. That is really hard to detect with a machine because that argument looks invalid because it's missing a component, but that component is something that's supposed to be understood by the audience already, which the machine might not be able to figure out. So the answer is like, maybe. Hopefully not. That's Skynet territory.
So you had did you see the question, last week you said that people should get their information from books rather than just from news sources. Many people only read the news or the news on social media. Can you briefly summarize why books are better? And please note, this is a library event.
I love books. Look at all these pretentious books. There are a couple of reasons for that. Well, one thing is that most people do only get their news from online sources. For the most part, I think that that's okay. So it still matters what those sources are. Like, I would be far more likely to believe something in the Wall Street Journal, a right-leaning newspaper with a good editorial board and a long history of effective journalism and so on. I'm not talking about the opinion pages necessarily. I'd be far more likely to believe that than I would believe something on InfoWars, for example. Similarly, I'd be far more likely to believe the New York Times than the Huffington Post. So even if you don't actually get primarily information from books, it still makes a difference. You can still be critical about what kind of news sources you believe. In the case I just gave, if I read something in the Wall Street Journal, I'd also want to know what the New York Times had to say about it, and vice versa. So the diversity of sources can sort of solve some of the problems with media bias, as long as you're diligent about it. So that's one reason. Books are helpful. The reason why books are so useful is if you want to know about an issue in more depth, the best way to do that is to read stuff written by experts in an extended format. The way that books are published is just different than the news. So a lot of news stories are sort of written while events are going on, before there's full context for them. If you don't know that context, it's hard to interpret why that stuff matters necessarily. Books give you the luxury of writing over a longer period of time, which adds some perspective to things and also means that you can be more complete. They have better references to other things that you can double check. And books tend to be written by experts in the area rather than journalists who are experts in reporting news quickly, but not necessarily as informed about the content of that reporting as someone who spends their entire academic life studying that, for example. Lastly, academic books at least are peer-reviewed, which means that books from an academic press, or even just like a good popular press, are far more likely to be seriously vetted by a number of people, experts in the area, an editor, and so on, that make it a lot harder to get away with outlandish claims. Having written a book in an academic press, believe me, there are all sorts of outlandish things I wanted to say and I couldn't because other people were like, "Are you sure?" And then I had to just fold. So those are reasons why I think that matters. Most of us can't read a book about everything that we're interested in, but if there are issues that are interesting to you, then read in that area. Figure out what's good. And one easy way to do that is to see, when you start reading about a particular area, is there a particular book or set of books that almost everybody references? Those are probably a good place to start, if that's the case. So books are great. Everybody should read books. Also just gives you background knowledge. You just know stuff.
I'm going to shamelessly plug libraries. If you do a search on the internet for scholarly versus popular sources, a lot of the results are in these things called libguides, which a lot of university libraries and their librarians have put together. And it's really like bite-sized information. I strongly recommend you do some research if you don't know what scholarly versus popular sources really is, and just like reinforces Calum's views. So thank you for
Yeah,
that.
I mean, I don't have to say this, obviously. I'm not getting paid for this. The Carnegie Libraries of Pittsburgh is one of the greatest assets that the city has. You have an immense wealth of information and people who are trained, responsible, thoughtful, and knowledgeable to help you navigate that information. That's incredible. That's something that most of us don't have access to. And if you aren't using that system, I mean, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here, but if you're not using that system, you're missing one of the things that like really is one of the great civic virtues of the city that we live in.
Thank you. Thank you for that. All right, final call for questions. Going once, going twice. I'm now pasting in the chat the link to our 7-question survey. It is the same questions as the last 2, but you learn new things. So that is the reason you should take the survey every time. Also data is good. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us on this journey of navigating information fatigue, and thank you to Calum for sharing your knowledge and expertise. Please keep an eye on our website for future programs like this, and also keep an eye, oh no, the link's not working. Well, keep an eye for the email tomorrow with the working link to the survey that I attempted to share early. Oh well, best laid plans. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your night.
Thanks, everyone.